Welcome to Wilson Center Now, a production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. I'm John Molesky, and I'll be your host for today's discussion of the state of the world's oceans and fisheries. And our guest is David Balton. David is a senior fellow with the Wilson Center's Polar Initiative, whose 34 years with the State Department included service as Deputy Assistant Director for Oceans, or Secretary, that is, for Oceans and Fisheries. David, welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks so much, John.
So last month, you testified in front of the, let me get this right, the Subcommittee on Oceans, Atmosphere, Fisheries, and the Coast Guard.
Yes, that's right.
Tell us about the testimony and what the focus of the hearings were.
The subcommittee was interested in the problem of illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing. The acronym these days is IUU fishing. It's a serious problem, and my testimony, drawn on the years I worked on this issue at the State Department, was to help the committee think about the issue more broadly. There's also some legislation that's been introduced. I had some comments about that.
Is there any way that you could put into a human context for us the scale of what we're talking about? It's so hard to contemplate the amount of seafood that makes its way to tables around the world daily, plus the ocean harvest that is necessary for that to occur. So what is the scope and scale of the problem? How much urgency exists around the health of the fish supplies?
It's actually hard to give exact numbers. There are a lot of different types of fisheries that take place in the ocean. Some of them are in reasonably good shape, but the problem is that a growing percentage of them are overfished and depleted. And then there is another category that's fished at maximum level. Unfortunately, that category tends to shift into the overfished and depleted category over time. So we've been seeing some bad trends. And related to the problem of overfishing is the fact that not all vessels, not all fishers follow the rules that are established. You know,
even those who don't fall into that illegal category.
That's actually the category I'm talking about. Illegal fishing or unregulated, unreported fishing is one of the problems of ocean fisheries. Even when nations get together and establish rules for ocean fisheries, for stocks that cross jurisdictional lines, it's difficult to enforce the rules against everyone. And there is unfortunately a high percentage of illegal fishing that takes place.
That urgency part of the question, though, are we talking about supplies being exhausted in 5 years, in 10 years, next week? Is there any way to even calculate that?
You're lumping a lot of different types of fisheries into one number and trying to do that. And the truth is,
I'm talking about those at high risk.
We don't even know just how much illegal fishing is going on. The data on that is very hard to get. There is some suggestion that efforts that have been made over the last decade have started to reduce it, but I'm not confident of that. What we can say is it still is a very serious problem. We have some new tools that we're working on. Congress is thinking about enacting some additional tools, and we need to get on top of it.
What are some of those? What are the successes to date?
So one thing that the committee focused on in particular was a treaty that came out of a part of the United Nations a few years ago. It's called the Port State Measures Agreement. The idea behind this treaty, and I was involved in the negotiation of it, is that all fish caught at sea ultimately need to be landed somewhere at a port. And it's at that moment that the port state, the country in whose port it is, has the opportunity to limit the amount of illegally harvested fish that can be landed or transshipped in port by taking a few fairly limited number of steps, and the treaty is designed to get countries to do just that.
Are there particular countries that are providing leadership?
Actually, the U.S. is one of the leaders in this exercise. I'd credit Norway, a number of others as well. But there are some, I think it's roughly 60 or 70 countries that have now ratified this treaty. It's in force. It's starting to be implemented, but we need to encourage more states to join, and particularly we need to provide assistance to the poorer countries of the world to do the things that the treaty requires.
Is this a bipartisan issue?
It is. On the Hill, this has been bipartisan. The treaty went through the Senate several years ago. Congress, on a bipartisan basis, passed legislation to implement it. And the current legislation pending before Congress has also been introduced on a bipartisan basis.
So I'm always curious about, on any environmental issue, if the level of activity is at the level necessary to address the level of the problem.
It's hard to say, John. There is a lot of activity. Whether it's at the level we need, we don't quite know. Fishing in the ocean requires cooperation among many nations. So even if some nations are on the ball and trying to push forward. Those who have large fishing fleets and who are not doing enough to control them remain a big problem. There is the weakest link problem.
What is the best organization to coordinate this type of activity? Is it the United Nations? What is it?
It's actually a kind of a hodgepodge of organizations, to be honest. At the global level, yes, the UN, Food and Agriculture Organization, is the place to go, and that is the place where this Port-State Measures Agreement was negotiated. But most fisheries in the ocean are managed at a regional level, in the Atlantic, in the North Pacific, in the South Pacific, and there are regional organizations that are now starting to work together more effectively to deal with this problem, because vessels move around different oceans, different times of the year.
Your colleague Mike Sfraga with the Polar Initiative often has made the point that the Arctic is almost a model for a higher level of cooperation among these various nations with a vested interest than you see in maybe addressing some other issues around the world. Does that extend to the issue we're talking about?
Yes, in a sense. But because the Arctic has been ice covered for most of its history, the problem of illegal fishing in the Arctic has not really occurred yet. However, the Arctic is melting, and a larger part of that ocean is now ice-free for longer and longer periods each year. And just last week in Greenland, 9 nations and the European Union signed a treaty to prevent unregulated fishing in the high seas part of the Central Arctic Ocean. I was there for that signing, and it was a good moment.
I read your testimony, and you list some other threats to the oceans in addition to unsustainable fishing: marine pollution, climate change, acidification. What are your areas of greatest concern?
It's really all of these stressors put together that are affecting
cumulative effect.
Yeah, marine pollution is a very serious problem. But let's take, for example, the fact that coral reefs are dying around the world. What's causing them? Well, it's a combination of all three things. Pollution, particularly nutrient pollution coming out from rivers, is helping to destroy coral reefs. So is the warming of the ocean and acidification of the ocean. And there are some types of fisheries that take place on and around coral reefs that also affects them adversely. So you can see it's a combination of things.
The UN report on climate change of the last several days,
yes,
pretty alarming stuff, and especially the language for scientists was unusual on that level of sounding the alarms. Do you allow yourself to go think of it in terms of optimism or pessimism, or do you just keep your nose to the grindstone?
There is no option but to keep working at these things. And the climate-related effects on the oceans are now becoming better understood than they were before, and I think there is more of an impetus to try to do things about it. For example, about a third of the carbon dioxide that we emit deposits in and mixes with the ocean, and this changes the pH of the ocean. It lowers the pH, raises the acidity. People didn't really appreciate this so much a few decades ago. Now it's much better understood. Oh, they're not entirely understood. And there is a sense that we really need to move forward.
Final thought, David, for the individual who is concerned. We saw things like dolphin-safe tuna become a standard.
Yes.
What can an individual consumer do to help?
There does seem to be a willingness among consumers, particularly in the United States and in Europe, to buy fish that have been harvested sustainably, imported legally. There's information available to consumers that didn't used to exist on what types of fish are okay to buy and to eat. In a perfect world, you'd be able to walk into a restaurant or at a market and know exactly where fish was caught, who caught it, whether it was caught sustainably, whether it's really the kind of fish that it says it is. We're not quite in that world yet, but nevertheless, there is a lot of information available to consumers.
Is there action in that area? Are there legislative initiatives to, what would be the terminology, to trace the fish better?
Traceability is exactly the word. And the last administration started an aggressive traceability program that this administration is actually building on. Europe has also done something similar, and so I think this is a growing trend.
Well, David, great to have you here at the Wilson Center, and thank you for joining us today.
Been a pleasure.
You can catch more Wilson Center now, either the video version that you're watching or in the podcast version by coming to wilsoncenter.org. Thanks for watching.